Welcome to this Prague Process policy talk on learning from 2021, what migration dynamics and policy developments to expect in 2022. My name is Malin Frankenhaeuser. I'm the moderator of today's discussion, and I'm very privileged to have two eminent speakers with me today, following their first policy talk a year ago. We're once again joined here by Jean-Louis de Brouwer, who is Director of the European Affairs Program at the Egmont Institute, and my colleague Ralph Genetzke, Director of ICB's Brussels mission. They're meeting again to have a discussion on 2022, but also to look back a little bit at 2021 and see what actually took place, if their expectations came to reality or not, and what the year ahead may bring. Last year, as this year, the COVID pandemic was a major concern, and we might have had more expectations of vaccinations having a different effect than still being in the grips of the pandemic as we are today. And we will also discuss policy developments on asylum and migration at the EU level and beyond, and what prospects we are seeing also in the wider European neighborhood. What migration dynamics might we expect in 2022? And of course, what could the Prague process contribute to when it comes to improving migration and mobility cooperation in the region? So first, I'd like to do a warm-up round and look back a little bit at 2021. We have the luxury of wisdom and hindsight, since we're a few weeks into 2022, to look back at the year that passed and ask our panelists what they're taking with themselves into 2022. So what really stuck with you? What were perhaps already some of the bigger lessons learned of 2021, and what was maybe surprising to you? I'd like to start with Ralph.
Yeah, thank you very much, Malin, and in Brussels, still good morning to everyone. Many thanks to Jean-Louis, but especially also many thanks to my colleagues from the Prague process for the initiative and to get us back together, Jean-Louis, after 1 year, which is actually quite interesting, sort of to meet again after a year, to look back, look ahead. Now, Malin, you said we should share our wisdom. I think we should be modest. Since looking back already will show that, yeah, it is extraordinarily difficult to look ahead, actually. That's probably already at least for me, one lesson learned from last year. But to start with, let's say, I think 5 points, and we'll certainly come back to some of them in more detail. But of course, let's start. You mentioned it. I mean, let's start with the obvious. I mean, that is COVID. I mean, you mentioned, expectations with regard to vaccinations and so on. I would formulate also expectations, but I think most of us were more hopeful a year ago, and it looked like as if we had sort of a way ahead, a new step by step, how things would then move ahead and then probably get back to a normal or a new normal. And I think we had to realize that now turned out to be different, and with a situation which is probably difficult to assess at the moment. Now, I think if I remember correctly, last year, I mean, we spoke, I think, a lot sort of about, on the one hand, we have migration practitioners, of course, when it comes to travel, mobility. I think last year there was I don't remember who published that, but there's a concept about sort of, will we see mobility bubbles? I think that is interesting actually to revisit. I think we had moments 2021 where we thought, okay, here we see a bubble, but I think now with the latest developments and virus mutations and so on, we have seen that this has creeped into whatever looked like a safe space again. So that is probably one thing, but I think then the whole discussion about access to vaccines, how would that, influence then probably, economic recovery, and by consequence could also have an impact on mobility migration patterns. I think there's not so much difference. I think inequality continues, is hugely impacted through access to vaccines in the different stages. Each time there is a new version of, to have protection, there is inequality, and that has an impact on, or possibly an impact on mobility and migration. But that's, so the whole area of COVID. Second point, certainly, I think we didn't discuss that in that detail last year, or only then for other reasons, but certainly political tensions at the external border of the EU, was much more present and came to the fore than anyone had expected. And plus, obviously, I think Afghanistan. And I think there is an interesting link to be made with regard to Afghanistan. A year ago, we spoke about actually the new US administration and re-engagement, and will we see more, more multilateralism. Now, linking that to Afghanistan, I think we saw a pattern where, especially from the European perspective, everybody had to follow a US timetable. So I think that has to be noted, the whole part on political tension, security issues, and so on, much more present than expected. On the EU side, we spoke last year, I think, a lot about the external dimension. That continues by all means. We'll come back to, you mentioned, we'll come back to the Pact. I think difficult discussions, we said that already last year, difficult discussions on the Pact, sort of a good start in the negotiation basis by the European Commission, which was put forward. But now, well, we are moving on. We are way, a year ahead, and well, everybody is looking for progress, and it is, I think, obvious that that is difficult. One issue which stands out, that is the European Asylum Support Office, as it was called, and I think it's as of this week that very officially, I think it's the European Asylum Agency. Their agreement between member states, the European Parliament, and the European Parliament was found. But we'll come back to that. Then that was my third point. To quickly, I won't be too long here in the beginning. Still, I think which will be interesting, and we can discuss that as well. The German elections, which, sorry, I'm influenced by that. I am German, but I think it will make a difference if it is implemented as it is written in the coalition agreement of the new government. There are elements which are different from the past, which will be interesting to see how that fits with how other EU member states look at migration. So that I'm definitely taking also into the discussion on what will happen on the EU level. And then I think we should not forget, I could stop here with the sort of, the main issues, but then I think we should not forget about, let's call them the mega trends. We touched up in them last year, and I think whatever crisis we see, economic, political, security, and let's only mention two. I think we mentioned them also last year. The climate impact, and we spoke about the impact, and there's, it's well documented, the link with mobility and migration, / then also green economy. And the other one we also spoke about is actually data, information technology, and artificial intelligence. That whatever happens, we will not influence that through the migration discussions and so on. It will move on. It will impact any parts of our life, and they are there and have to be taken into account also. Also in this discussion or other discussions by more the migration world, the migration practitioners. I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for that overview and tying it back into 2021 and what you're looking at for this year. Jean-Louis, what about you?
Thank you very much, Malin, and really appreciate having heard what Ralph was saying, because actually it took a lot of words out of my mouth while introducing this debate. Thanks a lot also to ICMPD for the Prague Process for having invited me again. I think that it's really challenging, by the way, to come back 1 year after on what we said in early 2021. And indeed, I mean, I would agree with Ralph. We have to be very modest in terms of assessment and even more forecast. By the way, migration and the future of migration and mobility is probably one of the policy areas where it is the most difficult to enter into the strategic forecast exercise, which is now advocated for by the European Commission, amongst others. So we have to be very modest and very prudent. So what would be my takeaways? They would be close to the one that Ralph mentioned. COVID-19. Okay, it's first and foremost a mobility issue before being actually a migration issue. But of course, there are close links between mobility and migration. As far as I'm concerned, I would point to two possible lasting consequences, and we might come back on that later on. Border controls. Specific measures were introduced in a completely haphazard way by all states worldwide. I mean, borders were closed, reopened, and everybody knows about the jokes concerning the different color codes for European countries and other third countries with regard to the situation. That cannot last. Some order has to be put in the house if one wants to go back to, I would say, a decent mobility regime worldwide and reopen these bubbles that Ralph was referring to earlier. The question is, what kind of measures will stay with us? Extraordinary measures, control measures were introduced. We all know, I mean, look back at what happened after the 9/11 with regard to terrorism fighting. We all know that some of these measures will stay with us. I was struck reading the Schengen proposal tabled by the Commission in December to see that indeed health concerns feature very high in the agenda of the EU institutions and the way they should be tackled, both at internal and external border. But the EU is not alone. I mean, let's look at what countries like United States, continental countries like United States or Australia, what kind of measures will they keep with them once the pandemic will be behind our back, but that once we still have to live with this kind of acute understanding of health threat. Second takeaway from COVID, there are obviously very little lessons learned with regard to legal migration. We all remember in 2020 and 21 how the role of migrant workers was praised to help health services in most of EU member states or global North state in general to cope with the first and second wave of COVID. There were expectations that positive lessons would be learned about that in terms of contribution of migrants to the social fabric, to the economy of receiving countries. I might be very pessimistic or too pessimistic, but I see very little surviving of this nowadays. Second takeaway, and well, let me say by way of introduction that when I was preparing this conversation and trying to put together a few ideas, I ended up sounding to myself rather pessimistic. So sorry for that. Second takeaway, I mean, the international protection framework is under unprecedented pressure and threat. Listen to all last intervention, public intervention of Filippo Grandi, for instance. He is sounding the alarm bells. Member states are retreating from their basic fundamental international protection obligation. And the EU and some EU member states are not amongst the last one to retreating from their international protection obligation. People used to refer to the so-called Brussels effect as a possible spillover, positive spillover of EU standards and norms in the area of, I would say, in the internal market, data protection, and so on and so forth. Here, we risk witnessing to a negative spillover effect and a negative Brussels effect on the international protection system. Third takeaway, the obvious securitization of migration policy. We saw it coming. It's not new, it was already there, but the trend has accelerated during the whole of last year, and it's still with us. Migration is more and more seen, approached, and perceived as a security problem, and the human dimension of migration is completely lost sight of today. We used to, be very critical with regard to what the Trump administration was doing at the southern border of the United States. We are moving in that direction. And we are not the only ones, by the way. There are many other, so-called receiving countries or countries which see themselves as receiving countries in the world, which are moving towards that direction. But we can come back on that later on our discussion. This translates into EU jargon in a Schengenization of the migration policy. When I look at the latest development, I have the feeling that we are back 20, 25 years ago, when the answer to the question, what is the EU migration policy? The only answer by that time was Schengen. It's all about borders. It's all about control of the external border, and it's a translation of this growing securitization of migration policy. I remember vividly that we were hopeful last year that, early last year, that maybe because the political landscape was completely overshadowed by the pandemic, and that's because of the public opinion were focusing on the pandemic and its economic, social, and health consequences, the EU could at last start thinking, talking, discussing, deliberating about migration in a different way than the classical crisis mode it has been following since 2015, 2016. We are still there. We are still there. Look at the knee-jerk reaction that followed what happened in Afghanistan and what happened in Belarus. We are not disconnected from the crisis mode that has been overshadowing, dominating the EU agenda since 2015, 2016. Last but not least, I'm afraid that we have not found yet the right way to enter into an adult conversation worldwide and at regional level between countries in terms of building cooperation on migration and migration management. It does not work. It does not work. It's not there. We can illustrate that later on when discussing about what the EU is aiming to do, but we haven't found yet the right terms of reference to enter into a dialogue between the global North and the global South, between the global East and the global West, about migration and the way it should be approached. A test from that point of view will be later this year. I don't remember exactly the name of this meeting, but the forum that will be convened by IOM in May, if my memory is correct, to assess the implementation of the Global Migration Compact. Might be too early, might be too late, don't know. Let's look at that. But clearly, we have not yet, states worldwide have not understood yet, or seemingly are still struggling with the concept that migration management is actually a common good, exactly like climate change is a common good.
Thank you so much, Jean-Louis, for building also on what Ralph said and bringing in some other consideration, securitization and Schengenization. I think that's the first time I heard that term, but very interesting to look at. Also the international protection regime and where it stands and where it's going. Let's then go back a little bit to that first point that you both mentioned, and that is what we're all still experiencing, and what, as mentioned, we thought that we would be in a different situation, and now we're finding ourselves in the grips of one of the largest waves in terms of numbers, at least rolling in over Europe when it comes to COVID-19. And you both mentioned that there were travel restrictions. Actually, a lot of them have been lifted, and I think that is different from 2020. Looking at 2019 and early 2020, there was some kind of achievement in terms of a more coherent approach, at least within EU, and trying to restore Schengen, freedom of movement as well. And you mentioned also that, of course, the impacts of COVID are mostly on mobility. In fact, when we look at migration, there has been an impact on labor migration and labor mobility. But when it comes to displacement and irregular migrants and irregular migration, numbers are actually up. If we compare the numbers in 2020, 2021, we're now 2022, and go back to the year before, 2020, and then even 2019, last year actually saw a rise in irregular migrants, and also the largest figures so far when it comes to overall displacement. So there, knowing also that the pandemic has aggravated economic inequalities, and countries are at various stages of recovery, and ideally recovery is still really ahead of us, we are likely to see increasing numbers also of people feeling the need, the push to leave their situations in search of jobs and better livelihoods. So these imbalances are likely to fuel more irregular migration also in 2022. What is your view on this, the pandemic, and what might lie ahead in terms of migration figures, not just mobility?
I think, I mean, I share your view, and I think also, I mean, some of the elements what you mentioned before, Jean-Louis, I think for me, for 2022, but then beyond, I mean, there's certainly all the ingredients there that we will have a result that we will see, you know, figures for irregular migration, for instance, going up when we look at different migratory routes. I mean, you mentioned economic imbalances, or inequalities. I mean, I spoke about, you know, the political tension, security concerns we have in various areas also there, where there was more hope. Let's take Libya, for instance, you know, with prospect for elections, and then not turning out as it was hoped for. So I think the ingredients are, for me, definitely there, that we will have, we will see figures also towards Europe, which will go up. I mean, whatever we think about Europe, living in Europe and having certain problems, I mean, comparatively to other regions, they are all relative. So it's still a region of well-being, you know, economic growth, and as you rightly said, Jean-Louis, let's speak about migration. And not only about borders and asylum. I think, you know, when we can speak about that also when we speak about the Pact, you know, referring to labor mobility or labor migration, then towards Europe, and the needs for them again have been documented for the last, I don't know how many years. But I think, I mean, speaking about COVID, I mean, one are the travel, the mobility issues, and Jean-Louis, I mean, very well pointed that out just before the different implications. But I think I think the change which is being made through technological solutions, I think there we will see, even on a positive note, I mean, a lot of innovation. Which can impact also the way we think about the need for migration and mobility. When does someone have to move to a different place to perform a certain job? So I think that is an interesting question, actually. But I think the issue for me of greatest concern at the moment with regard to the impact of COVID is actually when we think about the social cohesion of our societies. I think we have an impact of COVID by now, which we see, which has brought to the surface of tensions in many of our countries, societies, which were also not expected in that way. Now, you can say that is not directly linked to migration, but still, I think there are certain linkages because we have, often this is also related to a spectrum in the society which has certain opinions about immigration. And I think when we speak from our side about migration, I mean, integration is a crucial issue where we also speak about the social cohesion. So here, the cleavages, frictions in the societies, I find are very, very concerning. Sort of the rejection actually of the state, in some outright rejection. We don't accept that. How to handle that? What does that mean? To move ahead, and then not only to find agreement within a society, a state, but in the EU we are then with 27, which, well, certainly is one part of the explanation why it is so difficult to find agreement on migration and mobility.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on this, Jean-Louis?
Well, I think that, as I said earlier, we should really avoid entering into any kind of forecast exercise, including with regard to the future of the pandemic. I'm amongst those who like to hope that thanks that the Omicron wave might be the last, I would say, really big challenge we would be confronted with, and that after that we can expect that we could progressively, slowly get rid of the pandemic that would become an endemic and so on and so forth. I don't know. I don't know even if at the end the EU, amongst others, do perform much better than what I feared last year in terms of vaccine solidarity. There are still large regions worldwide where only a very small proportion of the population is actually vaccinated, and where, I mean, new, much more dangerous variant could originate from. So let's be very careful about, the future of the pandemic and its possible impact on mobility and migration. I would like, Malin, to share your optimism about states, including EU member states, trying to put their house together, to get their act together in terms of border controls and related health measures. What I keep in mind is that the subject matter was on the agenda of the December European Council. You might remember that. And that 2 days before the European Council, Italy, Mr. Draghi, decided in a unilateral way to impose a PCR test to any third country national, including EU citizens entering Italy, even those fully vaccinated. He did that in a completely unilateral way, and I heard that he was completely unapologetical about that during the meeting of the European Council. What does that mean? It means that if we are confronted again with possible spikes of new variants, I'm not so sure. I told you that I was on the pessimistic mode. Okay, so I assume, I keep on being, I'm not so sure that this obvious willingness to engage into a more cooperative approach would resist this kind of unilateral reaction, whether inside the EU or worldwide. Now, concerning migration pressure, of course, you are absolutely right. It's there and it will stay with us. It's there and it will stay with us. And most probably, again, let's refrain to enter into forecast, the way some areas, and in particular the African continent, have been hit not that much by the health consequences of the pandemic, but by the social and economic consequences of the pandemic, will most probably increase the pressure and increase the, be another incentive to move elsewhere, and most probably to try to move north. So, I'm not the only one of defending the view. IOM has published many papers and many studies about it, and I assume that ICMPD is working on that also. Traffickers' business will resume. is resuming, actually, definitely. So we have to be prepared to that. Are public opinion willing or prepared to have a better understanding of what migration means? There, it's very interesting. Migration is still very high in the list of concerns of public opinion, EU public opinion. When you look at the polls, the barometers, okay, it has gone down the ladder, but it's still there. I mean, it's about health, it's about economic situation and employment, but migration is still there. And mind you, there are still high expectations about the EU delivering on migration and migration-related challenge. So clearly, there is an understanding that migration is there to stay, and that the answer to the migration challenges must be found rather at EU than at member states level. But the question is, how do you deliver on that? And there I come back on what Ralph was saying. I mean, first, what does that mean in terms of expected outcomes? Would that mean a more generous approach of migration? I doubt. And also, and that could lead us into our next topic for discussion, where does that lead us in terms of decision-making process and decision-making capacity at the union level? So you were very right, Malin, to hit that chord. It's a very important subject matter to keep in mind, but I'm afraid that taking into account the expectation of the public opinion, taking into account what Ralph very rightly hinted at, that is to say that people, public opinion, are more worried, let alone more scared than ever about their future. I don't think that the atmospherics at EU level are conducive to any kind of balanced solution or answer to that challenge. Over to you.
Thank you so much. You made the segue already to looking then at what's in store actually for the EU, because you talk about border control focus and a securitization of migration, but at the same time faced with those insecurities of the public opinion, but also the migration pressures. Of course, it's very unlikely that you can take away such a focus, because you do want to, everybody wants to feel in control when we feel insecure and under threat. And at the same time, you mentioned Draghi's unilateral move very recently, and the EU working as a whole versus countries taking unilateral moves. A major point of discussion last year was the Pact and where we would move forward as a comprehensive framework on migration and asylum for the EU as a whole. We had the Portuguese presidency. They focused also on talent partnerships, but there were many issues that are still with us. Schengen is still with us, solidarity and return coordinator still hasn't been appointed. And this kind of also on specifically on the Pact negotiations, how that can be taken forward, and this all or nothing approach that at least was in the air last year. You also mentioned, of course, Ralph, that there have been some progress, and the EU Asylum Agency is now existing. Looking back at kind of where the Pact was and what expectations were and what lies ahead, what has happened on taking EU migration and asylum policy forward, and what has not happened and should have happened from your point of view. Can we continue with you, Jean-Louis, and then move over to Ralph?
Okay. Right. 1 year ago, expressing skepticism about the future of the Pact was seen by many, including Commission officials, are, as I would say, not helpful, because not giving the chance to look at the different facets of the Pact and maybe to reach an agreement. We are now 1 year on. The Pact does not work. I'm not saying it, the French presidency is saying it. I mean, it's very clear, very obvious. When you look at the priorities of the French presidency, it's Schengen, and we can come back on that. And as far as the Pact is concerned, they are absolutely clear about the fact that no one should expect them to deliver on the Pact, but they take a very brave step forward and propose a new approach. it's very unclear. It's very unclear until now. There was a first discussion at ambassador level. It's now at the level of the JHA advisors, and it will come back at ministerial level during the informal meeting, which is foreseen, if my memory is correct, in the beginning of February in Lille. The idea is a step-by-step approach. That is to say, they would actually, if I understood correctly what I read in the press or the well-informed many papers circulating around the EU institution, they would dismantle the pact as such, take pieces and bits of the pact, connect them in, I would say, a balanced way that would, in little mini packages, give some things at those member states keen about responsibility, some things at those member states keen about solidarity, and then try to move on. Very unclear what does that mean. Very unclear how the European Parliament will fit in that game, because many of these drafts, which were part of the initial version of the pact, are to be adopted by the two branches of the legislation. And we know that the European Parliament is actually struggling in trying to find internal agreement with the initial proposal as they stood. But okay, again, better that than nothing. Better that than nothing. I would say we have to try something, because actually the pact is stuck. And in all fairness, maybe there is someone in the audience that will chip in afterwards during the Q&A that will come with very convincing argument. I fail to find any convincing argument about the future of the pact. So some different approaches have to be tried. This is one. Let's look at it. I remember vividly when the Commission tabled its initial proposal, they were very happy and relieved to get as a first message from the first council meeting under the German presidency at that time that it was seen by all member states as a good basis for negotiation or discussion. I hope that we're going to have a somewhat more, forthcoming soundbite from the ministers about the French approach at the end of the Lille ministerial meeting. But that will be crucial for the future. This being said, and we can come back on that afterwards, about the balance and the relationship between the Pact and Schengen, what is very obvious is that the future of Schengen and the Schengen proposal and the Schengen governance will be centerfold in the agenda of the French presidency. They will focus on that. And that would be my last comment before passing the floor to Ralph. It strikes me that initially the Commission was keen to insist on disconnecting Schengen from the Pact. There were two completely different sets of issues that different tracks should be followed. And that is the reason why when they proposed the Pact, they did not propose at the same time the reform of the Schengen agreement, governance and legislation. Now, 1 year on, the two are completely connected. I mean, when you look at the proposals of the Commission concerning Schengen, that the one that were tabled in December, of course, there are cross-references to what is in the Pact and what should be decided in the Pact. So we are back where we should have been from the very beginning. We've lost 18 months about that. And that will by no means make the negotiation easier. Thanks a lot. Ralph, over to you.
Thank you so much. Ralph, yes.
Well, what to add apart from highlighting probably more points which show how complicated this probably is to find that common denominator. Because I think what is clear by now again as well is, and it's also in the literature, communitarization, or aren't we moving back, back towards even more intergovernmental tendencies in this area? So there's a bit of an overarching question of what happens, I think, in the EU, linked to very sensitive other policy areas, governance issues in the EU with regard to discussions on rule of law and so on. So I think there are interlinkages, yeah, which just, I mean, on the one hand, again, the migration world has to realize that this, that these linkages exist, are there, a reality. On the other hand, yeah, that it makes it very complicated. And absolutely, when reading, and then after, well, now we speak only about the new pact, which is 1.5 years old, not anymore that new. Before we had other initiatives to find agreement, the common denominator, and now we are faced again with a presidency which sees the needs, probably for good reasons, to come and to speak about an approach. So first we have to define an approach step by step. Again, it just shows that many things have been tried over the past years, and I wouldn't limit it actually to this commission, but way before, from various presidencies, by the commission and so on.
You mentioned the new coalition agreement also in Germany. What do you think in terms of the stakeholders involved also, and this year and moving forward or not making progress?
Well, I think, everybody has the French elections in mind. There are more elections to come, I think, as well. Of course, that plays in. I mean, the German coalition agreement. We have a coalition which I think has a fairly liberal outlook on labor migration. You have the Green Party in the government. There is some clear words on actually even on the external dimension. I mean, what should be part of when negotiating with partner countries and what not. So there are elements which I would think that are not necessarily shared by others. Now, what I do appreciate absolutely by the French presidency is the focus on Schengen, and I would actually, I don't know whether there was in the comment by my colleague in the chat I would like to refer to. This term, Jean, you used on Schengenization, which like this comes across rather in a negative way, and at the same time, I think it's, you spoke earlier also about the global common goods. I would consider probably Schengen as a European common good, if that exists, European common goods. So, for me, Schengen is a bit like the euro, sort of that whatever it needs to preserve it has to be mobilized, and I think that's where we are at the moment. Schengen is part of the EU's identity, and it needs right now, after all many years of experience, different things, developments, it needs certain corrective measures. But I would sort of, would like to give sort of a more positive connotation to, let's say, to Schengen and the efforts to have a working Schengen within the EU. I think the other element, but it's also which we discussed already last year, which is definitely there, is, we have certain things which were approved. We spoke about large-scale IT systems in the past, and so on. Implementation. Things have to be implemented by all member states, and if not, it can't just go through. And I think on that level, I think a lot of common agreement can be reached and is reached between member states. And we, at the more political level, we always speak about it needs, again, about, we need trust building and so on, which can seem to be surprising within the EU. It's apparently a reality. The practical implementation is absolutely necessary here. And I think there is actually, and again, we are more on the security side, but for instance, police cooperation. I think within the EU, there are certain proposals on the table. I think there's still a lot of room for further police cooperation, which can also, I think, have a very positive impact on preserving the Schengen area.
There's a lot to be said about getting your own house in order, and there's plenty that needs to be done also for a really functioning European migration and asylum policy framework. We talked a lot now about the so-called internal dimension, and of course Schengen is key to both to many things. It links to asylum and borders, and of course, as you mentioned, Ralph, it is also perceived as a European public good, as a key to what the European Union is and should be. But looking a bit further away from just within the European Union and beyond, there's a whole so-called external dimension also to European and EU migration policy. And during the Czech presidency, one major EU presidency event on migration will be the Prague Process Ministerial in October. And you mentioned also that the Germans want to revisit migration partnerships and cooperation on migration. And Jean-Louis, you mentioned that they still are struggling to find that right language or right approach to cooperation. And we have at the global level the IMRF taking place in May. At the same time, looking at the European neighbourhood and the pressures we mentioned before, not just because of COVID, but also because there are a number of security, there's tension in the European neighborhood. There are serious security issues going on, and there are hotspots on the European borders and that affect migration, potential migration movement as well. And these are not new. But some are new. We were all surprised by the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, and that led to a lot of concern. And I think this is still a concern that we should have in 2022. What is your view, looking, at the partners and the neighbors and the neighbors of the neighbors in the European context, and what we can expect when it comes to furthering cooperation and building functioning partnerships, and what are the issues that we need to keep on the radar and pursue further? Jean-Louis.
Thanks a lot, Malin. Before answering your question, I would like to take 2 steps back. The first one would be to definitely avoid a misunderstanding about what I meant earlier by the Schengenization of the immigration policy. I completely agree with what I find in the chat box and what I heard from Ralph about, the intrinsic value of Schengen, which is indeed, together with the euro, one of the achievements of the EU that is the most visible for the EU member states. And it's not for nothing that a certain number of our neighbors in the Western Balkan countries are now thinking in terms of a mini Schengen. What I meant by that was simply that, notwithstanding the endless efforts of the last 20 years, I see now again, we are back now to a situation where trying to deal with migration and develop a migration policy, control at the external border is seen as the one and only answer. That's what I meant by the Schengenization of the migration policy. Schengen is clearly something that we should, and indeed, you're right, Ralph, it is now threatened. Schengen is under threat, but and we should try by all means to preserve it. And certainly some of the elements in the Commission proposal are meant to, at the same time, reinforce and therefore preserve and safeguard Schengen. But that's what I meant when I was referring earlier to the Schengenization of the migration policy. First thing. Second thing, the German coalition agreement. There is, I think, a sea change in the approach of European affairs from the German government, and it might have to do with Angela Merkel passing the baton to Olaf Scholz. It's now that Germany is willing to engage into coalition of willings on a certain number of issues, where the former chancellor had fundamentally a totally inclusive approach, trying to have at the same time all 28, 27 on board. Now the German coalition government opens the door for a different approach. And that could help or not, but that could have an influence on the way the stalemates concerning the EU migration and asylum policy will be circumvented. It's about the past and the future, but my instinct, and when you look at the French initiative, the one that we mentioned earlier about the phased approach, my instinct is that we should now be prepared to think in terms of differentiated integration when it comes to migration and asylum policy, and possibly also free circulation inside the EU. That could be on the horizon for the better or for the worst. Now, concerning relation with third countries, there is a new acronym which that we are going to need to become familiar with, and it is MOCADEM. MOCADEM has now been set up by, it's a very complicated legal basis and structure, I have to say. It's the answer to the European Council request to have a better coordination of relation with third countries when it comes to migration and migration issue. What strikes me, and there I would really join Ralph in what he said earlier about the growing intergovernmentalization of these policies. When I read MOCADEM, although it is said that it is not a decision-making body, that it is meant simply to prepare the deliberation that will be taken and blessed at other level, that it will work in the full respect of all of the respective competences of the different stakeholders, it is basically bringing the Commission back under the control of the member states. Exactly like when you read what the French intentions are with regard to the Schengen governance. I mean, Mr. Macron is crystal clear about the Schengen governance. It is the member states taking back the control of Schengen. Again, for the good, it's not a value judgment, what I'm saying now. It's simply a statement about, I would say, the mood inside the Union for the time being. The Commission is not in the strongest position with regard to this development for the time being. Now, concerning what I said earlier with regard to relation with third countries, either neighboring countries or countries further down the migration routes, I need to be convinced, and I might be convinced, that trust has been restored, but I don't see that. It's still being seen as an unbalanced relation where, the global north is trying to impose its agenda to the global south, or the global east is trying to impose, is trying to impose its agenda on the global east, call it whatever you want, without actually taking into account the expectation, the requests, and the needs. The problem is also that, and again, I could not agree more with Ralph when he is inviting us to put our deliberation on migration into the much bigger political and social and economic picture. The problem is that we keep on looking at migration issue in a completely isolated way. We are never going to achieve anything on migration if we don't put that on the biggest picture. I'm a big fan of Mr. Borrell when he said once that the EU is strong in its external relation when it is strong inside. Why are we one of the biggest, if not the biggest trade power of the world? Because we have the internal market. How can we expect to be seen as a strong, reliable, stable partner, joint partner with third countries when dealing with migration, when they see the shamble the EU migration policy is for the time being? We have to put our house in order first, and then we'll be able to enter into joint adult talks and conversation with third countries. Thank you.
Ralph, what do you think?
Yeah, I think let's go on the external dimension. I think the problem is that always, the external dimension is always seen as the easier part of European migration policy, which is absolutely not the case. Now, everything you just said, it's absolutely there. I think with the MOCADEM and whatever, there are even more. I was told even more coordination mechanisms, or additional one also Commission-led related to the new financial instruments. Now, per se, coordination is good, and because it helps. You need to force also EU member states around the table and to share information. And from ICMPD side, I think we spent an extraordinary amount of time to support this type of coordination mechanisms, be it here in Brussels, be it in the field. It's just absolutely crucial. And I would absolutely subscribe what you said, and you refer to Mr. Borrell. There is something, I mean, the image we Europe give, and you know, not getting to terms or having disagreements and then trying to sort out things with regard to partner countries. Now, I mean, speaking about the external dimension, and here I'm paying tribute to Malin being responsible for the Vienna Migration Conference in ICMPD. I mean, for those who are interested, we defined sort of 6 takeaways on migration partnerships. And the first one, it's exactly what you just said, Jean-Louis. We said migration partnership is equal to foreign policy. Again, just underlining this point very much. I won't go through all of them, but another one is also the neighbors. You know, we have to look at the neighbors of your neighbors. I think that is, again, it's too much of it's a shortcoming. I mean, very often we just look at one country and not then the concerns of that country, actually, when we then speak about migration routes further down. That's also an area ICMPD, and we focus quite a bit on. I think another one, and here I fully see actually the value, I mean, the value and the raison d'etre of the Prague process. We say, you know, partnerships must be lasting. And that's why, as ICMPD, we always say that, you know, migration dialogues where you can have questions about, you know, should we sit again together and so on, but they provide for a bit sort of safe spaces where you have people, you know, where you sit together. Whatever happens, we will have political tensions, we have security issues, but we have safe spaces where we have to sit together and talk formally and informally. So absolutely, that's why Prague Process Ministerial is another step in giving impetus for the for the phase afterwards. And also, don't reinvent the wheel. And I would also, you know, within a migration dialogue, and you keep sort of also a memory which can be shared. I mean, people change in administrations and so on, but that's also, so here, migration dialogues, yeah, I mean, I think have actually great value. Now, there's one point with regard to the external dimension and seeing sort of the EU as an actor, which I personally regret very much, and that is, that actually that there's not sufficient, that one instrument is not sufficiently used, and that is resettlement. I think in terms of image of the European Union, where we are seen at the European Union as building up borders and so on, which personally linked to Schengen will say, okay, you know, this is our good, which we want to make work, and one of the measures we need is then the external border, which functions and is strengthened and so on. At the same time, there should be, I think there is absolutely room for, higher commitments to resettlement pledges by UNHCR and others. And I think that would be a very safe way for European member states with regard to security concerns, but a very visible measure also to partner countries to say the EU is an actor, EU member states are an actor in the world. We take you seriously. We see there is burden and so on when we have crisis. So I think there is room for improvement actually.
Jean-Louis, do you want to pick up on that? You also mentioned in your very opening remarks that the international protection regime is under threat and under pressure.
Yes, I mean, we have been elaborating mostly about migration by definition during this talk, but I think that we should not lose sight of that last dimension. I would elaborate a little bit on the Afghan case. When Kabul fell during the summer, the first reaction was we should bear in mind that 3 heads of states and government went to the microphones, to the cameras, and say out loud, not one single Afghan on my territory. 3 EU heads of states of government. Then there was an immediate concern about Turkey. I mean, what are we going to do? I mean, are we going to have another facility, or should the existing facility be extended to Afghan refugees, which was a problem that we've been living to for some times already. But I mean, in this initial reaction, everybody forgot that, okay, the people managing to leave Afghanistan once the evacuation would have been ended up, they will first go to Iran, they will first go to Pakistan, although the Pakistani border was closed. So this attention to the neighbors was completely absent in the first reaction of the EU. And clearly, I mean, I read indeed the 60 takeaway of your ministerial conference. I really find that they are full of wisdom with regard to this kind of broader approach. But again, I think that, and sorry to repeat myself, what I see now is that to think in terms of national bureaucracies. Ministers of Interior are trying to take back the control of the external relation when it comes to migration. This is a major mistake. This is a major mistake. This should be dealt with by, I mean, in the framework at national level, in the framework of an overarching coordination between, I mean, the different services, and in particular under the leadership of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this should be part of a much broader agenda. I mean, can we intellectually disconnect a dialogue with Iran on migration and reception of Afghan refugees, for instance, from what we are trying to achieve with them when negotiating or reopening the negotiation of the JCPOA? It's absolutely impossible. It's absolutely untenable. And indeed, our relation with Turkey concerning the Syrian refugees were always part of a much broader, difficult to handle, but still open agenda and dialogue with Turkey and the Turkish authority. So these are just two examples of the impossibility to disconnect migration issue and the dialogue and the partnership on migration issue from a broader agenda. When it comes to the Western Balkan countries, how can we hope expect as the EU to have again an adult conversation with Western Balkan countries on migration if we are not very clear about whether there will be enlargement or not, and under what condition? I mean, it's part of the whole picture, and it's part of the whole agenda. Indeed, I mean, I see MPD, and Ralph is much better placed than me to say that he's an organization that plays a key role for, I would say, keeping the link, I mean, keeping the connection, I mean, having the people talking with each other. But at a certain point in time, you need to do more than to talk. You have to enter into something much more operational, whether this is resettlement, whether there are talent partnerships. You mentioned talent partnership, Malin. But I think that, I mean, crossing that bridge, moving from conversation and dialogue to actual action, interaction, and operationalization will not be achievable if we as EU are not willing and open to put that in a much broader framework. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Ralph, you would like to maybe a short comment?
Yeah, no, just, I mean, I think operational examples, and again, ICMD, we do, you know, capacity building and cooperation with many countries, especially also the Prague Process region. I mean, we're not here about, you know, to name and pick out countries and so on. But as far as I know, in the Prague Process region, I mean, we do have actually good examples where there is a good cooperation on return and reintegration between the EU and the respective countries. So these examples, especially, I think more towards the east, actually they do exist. Yeah, so so cooperation is possible. That let's also have some positive notes in our talk. Are absolutely possible. Also with regard to Afghanistan, absolutely the statements I see a little bit. Yeah, there is sort of the statements again. We have, I mean, as ICMPD, we had our own concerns with local staff in Afghanistan, which we evacuated and so on. And we saw actually, I know at least one EU member state which opened actually its doors and welcomed hundreds of Afghans and their families without having a traditional Afghan diaspora and not being necessarily involved very strongly with staff or with armed forces and so on, that they are all local staff. So yeah, so but in terms of discourse, absolutely, as you said, that was the first image which was given. I think then there are certain, yeah, which more, let's say, which have less visibility in terms of humanitarian commitments. But again, I come to the point on resettlement. I mean, there on that front, I think much more could be done. I think the need is there. The need is there in Europe, but I would also extend that. And again, I mean, others are much better placed to speak about the countries in the which are in the part of the Prague process. But there are certain countries, I mean, looking at the economies and the need for workers, absolutely there. And we will always, I think this is also well documented now. At the same time, we have, we will have unemployment while we don't have the right profiles to match jobs where either we reskill at the national level or it's then filled through migration. But the need is there. I mean, listening to the private sector is just in some countries, and again, sort of the German bias. I mean, if you look at Germany, I mean, recent figures and studies, and it's not only the traditional IT sector. I mean, engineers. I mean, school teachers. I mean, health personnel. Anyway, that we know. I mean, the need is there. Then I think it is interesting, sort of, how is work organized? And I mentioned that before. But I mean, in the high-skilled, IT sector, does everybody have to move, or I mean, can't you do that from wherever you live? But for other parts, and I mean, the skilled sector, the lower skilled sector, I mean, there is still the need for workers. That's absolutely, I think that's absolutely clear. And that's part of the discussion that we say, when we speak about Europe about a migration policy, then that is also, is part of it.
No, I really appreciate that question. And I think that it's a question which is actually to be answered independently on whether we are in the pandemic-like situation or not. And Ralph's reaction was going exactly in that direction. I think that it really deserves a little bit of thinking. Because, okay, we have needs. I agree. I mean, we clearly have needs in all sectors that you mentioned and that you quoted Ralph earlier, but there are also needs in the countries of origin. And I mean, these needs might become even more acute because of the consequences of the pandemic. So we have to find the right balance between, in a way, sharing with them our capacity or poaching their manpower. Look at the debate about vaccine and vaccine production and the possibility to delocalize vaccine production plant in third countries. It's one illustration of that. Some of our neighboring countries, including, and I would add to that, some of our member states do suffer nowadays from a massive emigration. And we should really pay attention to that and the consequences of that. I could not agree more with what you said, Malin, about, I mean, this is a national prerogative. And that's really the problem at EU level. I mean, even if the best possible circumstances, it will be very difficult for the EU in the present division of tasks and responsibilities to try to, I mean, to set the scene for a common approach of legal migration. All the more than in many of our member states, this is not even the responsibility of the states. This is the responsibility of the social partners, which are together running the local labor market. So it makes a coherent and coherent EU approach very difficult with regard to that. But the question is there. There is an economic case for accepting more migration. There is also a demographic case for accepting more migration. And of course, the two types of migration flows, the two types of migration channels, the one based on economic needs and the one based on demographic needs, could be of a different could be of a different nature. Another challenge, and by the way, I will not elaborate further on what Hal very wisely said about, okay, we have also to factor into our analysis the impact of, new technologies, because actually, indeed, many of the tasks that are not performed nowadays in EU member states could as well be performed outside the EU by people connected via new technologies. So I think that this deserves, I would say, a very in-depth consideration. The obstacle remaining for the time being, and I come back to an earlier phase of our discussion, the difficulty for government taking into account the sensitivity of their national public opinion to just talk about legal migration, talk about the possibility of labor migration. Commissioner Johansson regularly in her intervention quotes the number of residence permits that are delivered on a yearly basis by member state, which is an impressive number. I don't have it in mind, but it's in terms of millions or 1 or 2 millions. Okay, there is actually nowadays immigration in the EU, regular migration, but no one wants to say it. No one wants to say it because people see that, okay, you are not elected at national or even at local level on the basis of a proactive and open migration and integration policy. But this discussion must be continued, bearing in mind that, okay, there are all these dimensions that have to be taken into account.
Well, well, even though I spoke before about sort of, are we, the big question, is it more intergovernmentalism and so on? In the end, I'm always convinced that, the pragmatic approaches and reality will then determine of what can be done and will be done. Now, even thinking back, and since Jean-Louis is here, you've been very much at the initiative of mobility partnerships in the past. Now, lots of discussion, criticism, how much mobility is in there and so on. Now, leaving that side aside, there was something which I personally found very successful, that once you had this instrument, you needed coordination, and it forced, on the one hand, EU member states and the Commission, on the other hand, the concerned partner country, also in most of them, but for instance, also in the East, put in place coordination mechanisms. And that in the beginning, it's nothing you can really measure immediately and so on. But I think it's, for a coherent approach towards the outside, it's absolutely needed. And let aside now the discussion member state versus or together with the Commission and the External Action Service, but only among member states. Some countries we have a huge number of member states. Either with traditional interests, with initiatives, and so on. So, as I said before, coordination, that's a discipline in itself. That's nothing which comes by talking about it or by saying it's necessary. That is a question where you have to invest actually time and resources to do so. So this mechanism will only work if that is realized, if it's, as I understand it, it's sort of led by presidencies. Presidencies change every 6 months. So you might see different dynamics, different priorities according to where the presidency put the emphasis on. It needs consistency, stability as in the end, technical too, but as I understand, it wants to give a bit more political edge also to it, and to push ahead and say this is what was approved in the council by ministers or heads and so on. So we have to live up to that. And then comes the whole dynamic we have with the where the European Commission is in the lead for programming and managing actually and the funds. But I am hopeful that in the end, the needs will determine that these different stakeholders in there find together. But hopefully, I think the need is there for the coordination. That's absolutely. I think coordination mechanisms, it's not just a Brussels and EU thing, which makes things complicated. It's needed. Otherwise, really at the very down to earth, down to base, if you want to implement something and deliver on certain action plans and so on, it will not be coherent. It will not have the impact which you might desire for.
Well, I could not agree more with what Ralph said. I mean, coordination is not a matter of structure, it's a matter of will. Either you want to coordinate or you don't. Usually people states or administration bureaucracies are boastful about coordination, provided that they coordinate the others and that they are not coordinated by the others. So, okay, as far as the Mokadem is concerned, the jury is out. I mean, it has just, I mean, it's fresh from the oven. Let's see whether it will help to deliver. I think that what will remain is also something that Ralph stressed. It's about priorities. It's about priorities. I mean, we've always been struggling at EU level about what should be our geographical priorities. Okay, usually there is a tendency to go for low-hanging fruits. That is to say, to try to develop forms of cooperation with third countries which are willing to cooperate with us, which are not necessarily the most problematic in terms of migration. But that's not where the problem is. I mean, the problem is to enter into a genuine cooperation with unwilling countries and to find ways and means to convince them to using most probably more carrots than sticks, but still a bit of stick too, to enter into this kind of cooperation. I still fear that there will be a risk of duplication with regards to this new instrument and the Mokadem. And I find that in the reference I'm trying to find the paper, I mean, they are going to base, yes, I find it here. I mean, they are going to work together with the integrated situational awareness analysis, SAA, which is, I think, being developed, which has been developed in the framework of the crisis management procedure, the ICPR. But I mean, to my knowledge, when I look at the organigram of DG Home, there is no unit there which is dedicated or labeled knowledge center. I mean, which is exactly about this. I mean, gathering information and analysis, developing analysis capacity to the present and future migration flows or migration trends. So, I mean, the relationship between, I'm just asking the question, okay, maybe this has found a solution. So why am I using that example? I said earlier that the jury was out, and I'm completely agnostic about the chances of success of Mokadem or not, but it's still a way for the member states to get back, to get, and the ministries of interior, to get this issue under their control. But I wonder if this is not another layer that, in the absence of genuine willingness to coordinate, will create more problem than bring solution. That's a risk. I chip in first. I mean, Malin, you will remember that the first thing that I said in this conversation was that we should refrain from entering into forecasts, because I mean, if we are invited again by ICMPD in the early weeks of 2022, we might be held accountable for what we say in answering that kind of question. I would say I'm going to be very brief because indeed we are running out of time. I said earlier that, okay, we have to make a different case for economic migration and migration for demographic purposes. I would focus on economic migration. Two statements. The first one, when I look at the literature that is available in member states, I mean, in the area of social affairs and employment policies, when it is indeed about dealing with the labor shortages that Ralph was mentioning earlier, it's all about upskilling and reskilling of the domestic labor forces. There is very little written or said about, I mean, the need for more migrants or more manpower coming from outside the country. I mean, you really don't find it in the official literature about that. So it tells a lot. Now, indeed, labor migration, economic migration could be still needed to fill gaps in the short term. When I was dealing with migration policy and having, dialogue with Employers Federation at national or EU level, I noted that their approach of legal migration, which might sound very positive, is a kind of hire and fire approach. That say, okay, we need migrant workers to fill short-term needs, to fill gaps which cannot be filled by, making a better use of the national manpower. But once, we have processed this upskilled, or either once we have processed, or if the business circle goes down and that we need less of these support, okay, then we can certainly, get rid of them or dismiss them more easily because they are mobile anyway. So, this pleads more for, I would say, temporary contribution of migrant workers, not that much on a permanent basis, which might be something that they wish or they need. Because, of course, in the world of today, migrants abroad can remain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, connected with their families and their countries of origin, thanks to the new technologies, thanks to the international television channel. So for them, temporary going to a third country, making money, sending back remittances, and then going back home becomes a very possibly appealing solution instead of the settlement migration, which itself would answer to the demographic need.
I don't think that there's really anything to add. I think the last point on the temporary migration, again, linked with technology and what that brings, I think that indeed can have an impact on migration patterns, and then a huge need actually to adjust policies on especially the sort of the receiving side. But then as we stressed also in the before, it's a bit in sort of a Eurocentric then discussion that looking already Western Balkans and so on, when you look at the numbers of how many young people left already, when we think about the objectives of Europe in the region and so on, stability and what happens in societies, there is something to take very much into account.
Thank you so much. Then I'd like to start closing. It's been a highly interesting conversation, and I would like to continue, but this is a good moment, I think, also to wrap up. We've talked about the impact of the pandemic, also in terms of creating friction in societies and social cohesion issues. We talked about the importance of Schengen, and we talked about the differentiated approach now to moving forward on migration policy. We talked a lot about the fact that the EU is a complex machinery, and interests and procedures and coordination needs are many. Also the fact that there is a tendency to want to be clearing your own house and getting your house in order, and to be strong on the inside in order to be strong on the outside. At the same time, we know that we need to be pragmatic and move certain things forward and try out new things. And where the EU cannot move as a whole at once, many member states can and do move issues and partnerships and cooperation forward on very specific issues. We cannot stress enough the need for trust and really mutual interests being met in cooperation across migration patterns, countries of origin, transit, and destination, and the fact that we continue to need dialogue platforms like the Prague Process to provide a continuous conversation and to do that in the good times and the bad times. I would now like to give the floor for any final remarks from your side. Jean-Louis.
Thanks a lot, Malin, for your brilliant summary. Of course, this was mainly dedicated to migration, but we have to keep in mind the connection between the migration agenda and the protection agenda. We slightly touched this. It has also to do, by the way, with the last item that we discussed. When you look at the way Germany managed to very successfully integrate the Syrian refugees into its labor market, it is another illustration of the need to keep the two together when approaching and analyzing in general the issue of migration and mobility. For the rest, yes, we are still not far advanced as the EU in building our migration policy. I remember I attended virtually recently a conversation with Antonio Vitorino at the occasion of the 20 years anniversary of the Migration Policy Institute. You remember that Antonio Vitorino was the first ever commissioner in charge of justice and home affairs. And he said that in his new capacity of Director General of IOM, what struck him is what the terms of reference about the debate on migration, the international debate on migration, were exactly the same nowadays as they were 20 years ago. So there is still business to do there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph.
Well, thank you. Very quickly, three points which are important for me. I mean, external dimension, we spoke about it extensively, but it is, again, I think at least for us, most of us migration practitioners, is to realize, I mean, the interconnectedness with all the other policy areas. We said in, our VMC takeaways, migration partnerships is foreign policy, but you can also, I mean, we have to think it broader. Otherwise, it's just not realistic and not living up to expectations. Second point on EU, I think, to come back, something you mentioned it, Jean-Louis, when referring also to the German coalition agreement. I mean, first, there must be progress. There must be progress at some point. I'm now also from a negotiation dynamic. I mean, soon we will be, 2 years after. I mean, hopefully there is a bit of a pressure building up in view of progress. But then the question on how to achieve progress, I think the point of, if not everybody is willing, do we do that with smaller groups and so on? I think it will have to be more prominent on the agenda to move ahead. No one leaving behind, always with the possibility of joining, but I think this should be stronger in the discussion than probably was the case before. And the final point I wanted to come back to, that again, an issue for me for concern is what I mentioned, it's the cohesion of our societies. As we said, well, if the EU is not strong towards the outside world, I think member state politicians are not strong and ready for compromise within the EU if they have frictions, cleavages, and all sorts of other, new movements or other opinions at the national level. So when it comes to migration, so at the integration, but more broadly social cohesion, also following impact of COVID, I think is of utmost importance. Thank you.